The UFC isn't just what happens inside the octagon on fight night. Strangely enough, the wildest stories in sports history always happen outside the cage, and some are so dark that the UFC pretends like they've never happened at all. Whether it's the mysterious disappearance of fighters, a live hostage situation being exposed during a UFC walkout, or fighters getting locked up for life, these are the disturbing stories that the UFC wants you to forget. Most recently, Brendan Allen fought Renier de Ridder, but it wasn't just the fight itself that got the headlines. During Allen's walkout, the crowd were high-fiving him and shouting like they always do, but then something very strange happened. A so-called fan held their phone up toward the camera, showing what appeared to be someone in serious distress.
Flags as a nod to his mother's side at 9 years.
Immediately, Reddit was flooded with theories, with one really sticking. It was claimed that for some unknown reason, the phone was showing a live hostage situation. It's supported by rumors that the person was taken out of the arena by the police and presumably interrogated, but also because other camera angles discovered the guy was hiding his face. Yes, that is a Rey Mysterio mask from WWE. Nothing has officially come of it yet, and we don't know if it was just a prank that caught fire online or an actual life and death situation. But this next story features the actual disappearance and murder of a former UFC fighter. If you don't know the name Abdul-Kerim Edilov, no problem, 99% of UFC fans won't. But this guy joined the UFC back in 2016 and on paper could have been a serious problem at 205 pounds. He had 10 straight wins by first round finish, one of them against Yuri Prochazka, and got another finish in his UFC debut. But after this, he mysteriously never fought for the UFC or in MMA ever again. It turns out that Edilov had major political connections and ended up serving as the deputy prime minister of Chechnya under one Ramzan Kadyrov.
Нету у нас геев. Если есть, заберите в Канаду, хвала Аллаху, подальше от нас. Аузу билляхи минаш шайтанир раджим, чтобы не было,
If you don't know Kadyrov, he's been described as a warlord dictator behind the disappearance and murders of numerous journalists, claimed to have led homosexual purges in Chechnya and more. In short, one scary individual. But after just 2 months in his political role, Edilov resigned out of the blue with rumors of a falling out between him and Kadyrov. In Chechnya, drama with Kadyrov doesn't end well, and just a month later, the former UFC fighter with genuine title potential was pronounced dead by the Chechen government, with no cause given. Kadyrov never spoke on the matter, and considering how his favorite fighter is now Khamzat Chimaev, it's one the UFC definitely doesn't want any attention brought to.
I even saw the Chechen leader, how do you say his Ramzan?
Ramzan, yeah.
He surprised you with a Mercedes-Benz?
yeah, actually it gave me 3 times.
3 Benzes?
Three Benzes?
Yeah.
But while that story may have flown under the radar, this next case caught all the headlines, and it sadly ended up with the imprisonment of an all-time heavyweight great.
Cain Velasquez, in my humble opinion, when I look at all of the different heavyweights that I've personally seen fight, Cain stands out as the best. Wow. The reason why Cain stands out as the best is because he has superhuman endurance. Yeah. And his ability to put a pace on guys, you would see these guys just wilt under the pressure of him. And I think with Cain, and this is where it gets really interesting. What did him in is probably what also brought him to the top, is his mental toughness.
Cain Velasquez at one point was considered the heavyweight GOAT, probably by most people within MMA. But despite his legendary career being said and done, his name would hit the headlines yet again, and not in a good way. In early 2022, Velasquez was arrested on an attempted first-degree murder charge. But during the car chase where Velasquez tracked them down, he missed and hit the man's father, causing non-life-threatening injuries.
In February 2022, Velasquez chased and shot at a vehicle carrying Harry Goulart along with Goulart's mother and stepfather. Velasquez believes Goulart molested one of the fighter's young family members. Ultimately, Goulart's stepfather was hit by the gunfire. Today, the 3 victims spoke before sentencing, describing the fear they felt during the 11-mile high-speed chase and shooting. The stepdad, who was hit twice, says he doesn't have full use of his right arm anymore.
After a lengthy trial process, Velasquez was sentenced to 5 years in prison despite almost 40 letters of support from fellow UFC fighters and staff.
5 years. That's the sentence for former UFC champion Cain Velasquez after the fighter pleaded no contest to attempted murder and other charges. His lawyer asked the judge to release him on probation, but now expects Velasquez will ultimately serve 1 year in prison after getting credit for time served in jail and in home confinement.
Whether you think Cain was justified in his reaction or not, having a former UFC champion in one of the heavyweight division's best behind bars on an attempted murder charge isn't a good look.
If you're not a father, you do not understand the murderous rage you would have if some man molested your baby. You don't understand. It's you would see red in a way that no one can describe to you unless you're a parent. That fucking anger is, I mean, if there's ever a plea for temporary insanity, that's the plea.
Over the years, MMA has always faced stereotypes for being a barbaric blood sport with thugs competing. And while fans of course know that's not true, stories like this definitely hurt the reputation of the sport, which is why the UFC would much rather you forget all about the story. Velasquez is eligible for parole in March 2026, and hopefully for him it has a positive resolution. But this next story is one of the darkest, and it spanned for a quarter of a century. I'm sure UFC fans may have seen this famous clip from all the way back at UFC 4 in the mid-1990s.
And he lands to the midsection of Joe Son. Keep working. That is allowed in this competition. That is brutal.
While the guy on the receiving end is Joe's son. Embarrassingly, that was his one and only UFC appearance. After this, he went into a bit of acting and actually featured in Austin Powers back in 1997. But the one thing most people remember him for is his brutal criminal record. In 2008, long after his short and unsuccessful MMA career had finished, Joe's son was arrested for kicking in the door of his roommate's car. And while that isn't much of a serious crime, it uncovered something much more sinister. The former UFC fighter had to provide a DNA sample as part of the arrest, and it just turned out that son's DNA was directly linked to an unresolved rape case dating back 18 years prior to Christmas Eve in 1990.
Young girl, 19 years old. Late at night, early morning of Christmas Eve, 24th December 1990. She's driving home to one of those big apartment complexes out on Burgers. Okay? She parks in the carport. 2 guys jam her in the carport. They grab her, throw her in the car, drive her some distance away.
That's bad.
It's very bad. And the DNA tells us it's you.
It turned out that Joe's son and another man had kidnapped a woman in their vehicle, raped her, and threw her out on the road without her clothes. He allegedly even said, "It's Christmas, it's your lucky day," to the victim.
You recognize anybody in that? That's you, right?
That's me.
And what we did, showed that to the girl who was kidnapped. She goes, 100% certain it's him. I've seen that face every night I go to bed. She said, that's the face I've seen of the guy who kidnapped me, one of the guys who kidnapped me and raped me. I mean, just that alone screws you, okay? No doubt about it, okay? And the DNA saying, yes, you're the guy.
For 28 years, Son had gotten away with the crime. With all the charges combined, Joe Son's prison sentence could have been up to 275 years. But due to the time that had passed, he couldn't be tried on everything in court. So instead, in 2011, Son was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after just 7 years. And while that's definitely enough to make him one of the UFC's worst criminals, that possibility of parole after 7 years was quickly taken away after Son committed yet another heinous crime. It was revealed that after just a month in prison, Joe Son had beat his cellmate so bad, he ended up dying. Son was convicted of manslaughter and received an additional 27 years sentence on top of his existing one, meaning he won't be able to apply to parole until 2045 when he'd be 75 years of age. Unfortunately, a lot of the stories are violence towards females, much like this next case that landed a near UFC title challenger in prison for half a decade. Unless you're a real MMA historian, the name Josh Grispi will mean nothing. But back in 2007, when the UFC acquired the WEC, he was set to face Jose Aldo in the very first UFC featherweight title fight.
UFC just announced the WEC-UFC merger. You've been pulled out of your fight, and now you're fighting for the title. How does that sound?
Sounds great, man. I've been looking, this is what we all
getting there to do it, get to the title, and you know, came at a weird time, but I feel like it's, you know, things happen for a reason. This is good.
Grispi was on a 10-fight win streak, with 9 of them being first-round finishes, but injury forced Aldo out, and Josh decided to risk his #1 contender status and accepted a short-notice fight against a young up-and-comer. It just turned out to be one Dustin Poirier, and this is where the downfall of Grispi's career, and in truth, his life began. He lost to Poirier, lost his next 3 in the UFC, and in the space of 2 years go from the #1 contender to being released. But it's here where things went from bad to worse. A year later, it was announced that Grispi had been arrested for assault and battery on his wife, and after posting a $2,000 bail, he attacked her the very same day. In what one police officer called the worst case of domestic abuse he'd ever seen, Grispi used his MMA training to beat his wife and unleashed his bull terrier dog onto her also. Police found 20 marijuana plants and 15 grams of cocaine in Grispi's house, with his wife saying the abuse had been going on for at least 2 years. Grispi was convicted on 25 out of his 29 charges and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison back in 2017. And while that was a much lesser known case, this next one is arguably the most notorious domestic violence case in MMA history. Born Jonathan Copenhaver, the man who legally changed his name to War Machine is currently serving a life sentence in prison for a brutal attack on his former partner, adult actress Christy Mack. Outside of a 1-1 stint in the UFC and a brief appearance on The Ultimate Fighter, War Machine's MMA career is pretty forgettable.
War Machine. And it came out, and I did a thing for that, and it just depressed me. It just brought me down, because that was a kid. Did you know him?
I had him on the podcast.
That's right. When he was on the show, there's some guys that are just evil, and there's other guys that I think that if they had the right people around them, they could have made different choices. And he was like a goofy. He had issues. He was emotional. He always felt like the stack was against, cards was stacked against him type of thing, but he was still, there was something likable about him on the show when he was on season 6 of The Ultimate Fighter.
But due to his public relationship with famous adult actor Christy Mack, War Machine was actually a well-known fighter amongst fans, despite not doing a whole bunch on the sport.
There he is, John Copenhaver, and he's cut his hair. There he is, War Machine himself. Should I call you War? How do people say your first name? Do they call you War? What do they say?
I mean, I go by John, man.
Oh, okay. All right, well, John...
I mean, War Machine, that's just for legal reasons.
Before the relationship began, though, War Machine's violent tendencies had already shown themselves. He spent over 2 years in prison from 2010 to 2012 after 3 different cases of assaulting people.
I just did the year. I got out. I was, out for 7 months. I was doing very well, I beat Huerta. I had the Bellator tournament coming up. My probation officer, I had no problems with him. I was just living my life, man, and it was devastating, man. I only signed that deal to admit my guilt and for the Vegas case because it was a very old case and it's been dragging on, and I wanted to get it over with. The district attorney said, all right, man, we'll just sign for a deal, pay the restitution, and do probation, no jail time. I was like, all right, man, let's do it, who cares, I signed it, and I went in front of the judge, and she's looked at me and she hated me, man. She was like, look at you, look like you're gonna pop. I think you're on steroids, and it started going after me. She goes, you know what, I'm not going to honor this plea agreement. You need to go to jail.
Fairly quickly after his release, though, he and Mack began dating after meeting at a photo shoot, with the adult star being spotted cage-side at his fights. According to Mack, War Machine's violent behavior crept into the relationship a few months in, which after a while led to the two going their separate ways.
I noticed you have a bit of a tattoo on your neck there. A new one.
Oh, yeah,
the throat?
We got at least see hers. Hers is cooler.
Yes, I did see it. It says property. Yes, okay. There it is, right there. Property of War Machine. It's getting a little physical. Why on the neck? Sometimes that's ill-advised.
But one evening, War Machine let himself into Mack's property with an old key he had, and when he found her with her partner, unleashed a vicious beating on the both of them, but mostly to Mack. After a 2-hour assault, Christy Mack was left with 18 broken bones around her eyes, a broken nose, several missing teeth, a fractured rib, and a ruptured liver. And due to her status, the news hit the mainstream media.
At 2 o'clock in the morning,
She was knocking on it like crazy. You can hear the banging.
Christy Mack kicked, beaten, and bloodied. Her hair sawed off with a dull knife she says John Copenhaver used in an attack that was both violent and too graphically sexual to explain on television.
While awaiting her trial, War Machine tried to commit suicide, but his attempt was foiled by a police officer, and he was instead moved to a medical ward. And when the court case started, War Machine was spotted by the judge laughing to himself as Mack was testifying.
Was there sexual violence as well?
Yes, there was.
Specifically, Judge, just like the records.
In the end, War Machine was found guilty of 29 different felonies, including kidnapping, assault, and sexual assault with a weapon. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 36 years, meaning in his absolute best case scenario, War Machine will remain in prison until 2053 when he's 71 years old.
Where do you? But I do know when I get out, when he gets out, he will kill me.
This next story doesn't feature a UFC fighter, but instead it's the UFC boss himself, Dana White. The incident went down in a nightclub in Mexico on New Year's Eve of 2022, and a video of Dana and his wife Ann both slapping each other went all over the internet. You can see Dana's wife slapping him, and in response he hits her back. Men are told to never raise their hands to a woman, and especially not your wife.
I can't believe that there are people online that are actually defending Dana White's actions. I can't believe that there are fans, fighters, pundits, if you want to call that, defending Dana White. And guess what? If you don't see them, you're not looking hard enough because they're there. Defending Dana White's actions and saying that because he was slapped first, it's all good. All's fair. Equal rights. Excuse me, where I come from, you get slapped by a woman 10 times, you walk away.
Ironically, Dana was in the midst of promoting Power Slap at the time, but the prospect of being labeled a wife beater was terrible news. As a result, people were calling for his head as the UFC boss.
What kind of message are you sending to your fighters, to your employees, if that goes unpunished? If that goes away without any repercussion? What kind of message is that?
After all, the head of the biggest fight company in the world hitting his wife isn't a good headline. In fact, the California Legislative Women's Caucus wrote an open letter to the CEO of the UFC's parent company demanding Dana's removal. It was even signed by a state senator. The UFC's parent company actually stayed silent on the matter. In the end, a rather ashamed and embarrassed Dana White issued a strong apology. He claimed both he and his wife had consumed too much alcohol, said it never happened before, and would never happen again.
It was obviously a horrible personal experience, and you know, there's no excuses for it. Something that I'm gonna have to deal with and live with for the rest of my life. And one thing that I do want to clarify in this thing that I didn't talk about on TMZ because I didn't expect it and I didn't see it coming is the people that are defending me. You know, there's never an excuse. I'm sure you guys have read some of the same stuff that I've seen. There's no defense for this, and people should not be defending me.
The reaction within MMA was actually pretty mixed. Of course, everyone agreed it was a huge mistake, but many felt that it was just a big misstep that was caught on camera and amplified simply due to who Dana White is. Either way, his career remained undamaged, but it's one the UFC would love to have buried. But one story that did get buried is the Russian heavyweight sentenced to almost a decade behind bars for the kidnapping and attacking of a wealthy businessman. Dmitriy Sosnovskiy was a legit heavyweight prospect back in 2018. He was 10-0 with 8 first-round finishes, had beat Fedor's younger brother Alexander Emelianenko, and just notched his first UFC victory. Fans didn't know what Sosnovskiy's ceiling was, but many expected he'd easily break into the UFC's top 15. But that all changed when he was randomly released from the UFC in early 2021. It turned out that Sosnovskiy had been arrested in Moscow on suspicion of extortion and abduction, which turned out to be true. Along with 4 other men, the UFC fighter kidnapped a wealthy Russian businessman and after taking him to a secondary location, threatened to murder him unless he paid them 400,000 rubles, which is just under $4,000. When the man refused, Sosnovskiy choked him unconscious. He was later able to escape and report what had happened to the police. In the end, Sosnovskiy was sentenced to 8.5 years in a maximum security Russian prison. And although Sosnovskiy wasn't known to MMA fans, this next criminal definitely was. Phil Baroni was a staple in MMA for a very long time. Whether it's the UFC, Pride, Bellator, ONE FC, and numerous other organizations, Baroni has fought under their banner. But there were always question marks around his nature.
You sense somebody's character, and it's like, all right. And I remember at the time, I think it was his stepdad going to me, he's like, yeah, you know, people say you got to be loyal, but, you know, if the guy can help you, they're not in the ring with you. If the guy can help you across the street and better than the guy who you would here, then, and I'm like, oh, okay, this makes all sense to me. You know what I mean? You got to kind of put it all together. And then I know that you put that with all those horror stories I had from the guy from Long Island. So listen, you know, I wish the guy well. You know what I mean? But so we never really clicked after that.
But years after that interview with Matt Serra, a serious scandal came out featuring Phil Baroni and the claim he murdered his own wife. He was arrested in Mexico in early 2023 and reportedly sentenced to somewhere between 30 and 50 years in prison. At 49 years old, there's a fair chance he never steps foot as a free man again. According to a police report, his wife admitted to having an affair, and in the argument that followed, Baroni saw red.
He had smoked some marijuana, and they got into a fight, and he said that she told him that she'd been sleeping with someone else, and he snapped, and he threw her into the shower where she hit her head, and then she laid there. And then he said that he helped her up, he took her to the bed, he took her clothes off, put a sheet on her, and then she asked him for a cigarette and a beer. He went out to go get her a cigarette and a beer, and then he brought them back, and when he came back, she had no vitals, okay? So that's his story.
Baroni claimed when he returned his wife was unresponsive, but sadly, the signs of something like this happening were already there. Back in 2014, Baroni was cut from Bellator after publicly defending War Machine during his trials for domestic violence, claiming it was just a misunderstanding between the two.
War Machine, the one guy to show up at his trial, to be there for him. And again, you show me your friends, you show me who you are. And it was Phil Baroni. Now, Phil Baroni's not a good guy. I know the guy's from Long Island. A million stories about him. And
well, isn't he in jail right now?
Well, that's what I'm saying,
in Mexico.
man.
Yeah.
Not only did he be there for War Machine, he outdid him. You know, War Machine put his girl in the hospital, beat the shit out of her. And now, Baroni's in jail for, allegedly,
murder,
killing her. Murder in Mexico.
But what wasn't a misunderstanding was the UFC allowing the most jacked fighter in history to compete with the entire world knowing he was on steroids. It's of course Brock Lesnar. Back in 2016, he co-mained the biggest card in UFC history, UFC 200 against Mark Hunt. It was put together at the last minute, and because of this, Lesnar was given an exemption from USADA and didn't have to go through the numerous months of testing before he could compete. It was obviously a big red flag.
The UFC granted Brock Lesnar a special exemption on drug testing, which is insane. What? What?
In the lead up to the fight, Lesnar looked huge. He obviously always looks massive, but this was something else. Every MMA fan had serious suspicions he was on a little more than protein shakes. On fight night, he ragdolled Mark Hunt for the decision victory, but that was only the beginning of the story. Less than a week after UFC 200, it was announced that Lesnar had tested positive for a testosterone replacement therapy type drug, and the fight was changed to a no contest.
Of course you're a little bit disappointed, but at the same time I was surprised with his physique. He was very big. He looked better now when I fought him 4 years ago. So that was like, what's going on? And again, I fought Mark Hunt, I fought Brock. I defeated both, but what I remember about Hunt is that he was the strongest guy I ever faced. He just threw me on the ground like this. And he was being manhandled by Brock, so that was a little bit suspicious too.
The UFC was scrambling to put on a major show, and in truth, UFC 200 was a disaster. The McGregor-Diaz fight couldn't happen on that evening, John Jones tested positive and cancelled his fight against DC, and Lesnar was quite clearly allowed to fight when the UFC knew he was high risk of testing positive. Nowadays, UFC 200 doesn't get mentioned all that much anymore, and Lesnar's involvement is a huge reason why. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video on disturbing stories, we did a recent video deep diving one of MMA's weirdest stories today, the controversial rise of Derek Moneybag. You can check it out here.